it's an interesting question only because whether or not there is a industry defined definition of federated search, I think that there's a lot of different definitions that people use kind of interchangeably. But I think largely, I would say the large amount of our industry looks at federated search as this concept where I have all this data coming in from different sources. I might have 6 different systems. I might have 2 different content management systems. I might have a database. I might have a file system. And it's really this idea that there's all these different kind of discrete areas that content and data live. So if I was to say, hey, I'm looking for something on our website, but I also need to check our Google Drive as an example, do a search on our website, and I have to go do a search on Google Drive. And in that sense, I've now performed 2 queries. So if I was to create some kind of automated system or service that performed those 2 queries and then gave me a single result set, that's federated search. And so you think about it from, a number of different systems. And quite frankly, and largely, that's where Coveo got their start. In fact, I was around when Coveo formed and when they started, and they had an appliance type of federated search that would go out and crawl local files, hard drives, SharePoint, any connector you could think of. They would be able to crawl and then pull in all these different types of content into an index or multiple indexes. And so they would have each index for each federated search. And then when they would do queries, they would run queries against all of their indexes and kind of create like a unified search. And that was actually Coveo's start. They targeted the enterprise. We were actually, where I was previously working, we actually had a Coveo enterprise application server in our office, and they had a little Windows desktop widget where I could search for something that I was looking for, and it would scan all of our file drives, it would scan my email, it would scan, the website, and I could find content of what I was looking for based on that. And so they've evolved into obviously now this big search company. But when I think of federated search, that's what I think of. And it's really is this idea that there's all these different, kind of bespoke systems that have data, and we want to be able to collect that information.
And in that case that you just described, was that a workplace search, like an internal employee search kind of application? Okay. So what's interesting as you're just defining that, and even before you talked about Coveo, what was fascinating was you kind of touched on sort of the methods that are used there, because one was there's multiple searches that are going on across different data sets, or data stores, I should say. But then there's also this concept that you're unifying the data store. So the question I have is, why did they even call it federated from the beginning versus something like unified, right? Because ultimately, if you think about federated, there's 2 approaches, like you just mentioned. You could either do it in terms of the data, or you could do in terms of just from an interface standpoint, it's like the search itself, right? Can be queries, right? So do you have any context on that?
I can make some assumptions, right? Like, this is also around the same time. And again, this was 15 years ago, maybe. I mean, it's been a while now. And so this is also around the time where things like Active Directory federated services started coming around, where the word federation meant, hey, I'm taking something at an enterprise level and I'm able to kind of basically share out this function or data that I'm using into other parts. And so we're going to start to call that like a federation. I could be wrong, but I think when we start thinking about the term federated search, I think that really came from, whether it was a marketing lens or it was just easy for people to understand that if we use the term federation, we're really talking about multiple systems interacting with each other.
Yeah.
I largely think that's where the term federated search comes from, and is why, especially in our industry, like it is, for lack of a better word, the household name that we use for when we talk about search in general, especially when they're, you start adding crawlers. But there is a a distinct difference, and I think, when we think about unified search versus federated search, and I mean, Samir will kind of laugh, every time about this, but like there is a difference. And the biggest difference is under a federated search, you're not really unifying a single index. You're crafting a query mechanism that is querying multiple data points or multiple sources,
Right.
and then cataloging that into a single response. That's true federation.
Exactly.
Whereas in a unified search result, we're still looking at multiple systems, but we're doing it more from an ingestion perspective. So
Right.
we may have crawlers that are going to go out and, hey, I'm going to crawl this system. I'm going to crawl this system, and we call them crawlers because that's the household name. I mean, at the end of the day, we're just looping through some kind of API or scanning, scraping a web page or following links. There's a number of different things that we can do that we would call a crawler. And we're taking all that and creating a unified object of data that is then stored into a single index. So now we're doing this translation process where, the data structures are completely different on the things that we're reading, but now we're basically creating an interface. We're saying, okay, we're going to take this structure, we're going to mold it into the structure that we want. Here's all of our fields, and now we're going to store it into a single index.
Exactly.
And that is a unified search where our search queries only have to hit one index and the content all resides in one catalog.
Right. I've seen the term like, query federation, versus, and so what you're describing there, this next question was about, why do we see so many different perspectives out there on federated search? And I think you already answered it. Basically it was like people call it different things. They have their own approach. Is this just marketing differences, or are there technical differences too? And what you're describing is that in terms of the actual definition of like, accepted definition, and your example of authentication was a perfect example, because people needed to do that within a very specific technical framework because of compliance reasons and other things, right? And so, it sounds like federated search grew up with having some of those similar types of, again, the underlying mechanism had to dictated whether or not it was actually federated. Yeah. But now we reached the point where like some of these use cases, it's really more about just kind of unifying the experience, right? It has a lot less to do with sort of like the architectural requirements.
Yeah. And largely there's two primary user bases that this industry typically targets. We target our technical developers, but we also target our non-technical, or maybe technically not as savvy. We
Right.
Lots of technical, digital marketers out there, but we target both. And I think from a perspective of not having to retrain, I think it's easier to say federated search because there's already this like baked in idea that, okay, I understand federated search. I'm just looking at multiple sites. And so then, at the end of the day, the effect is the same.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So then what is the real problem that customers are trying to solve? You touched on it, but I'd like to really hone in on that and answer it in a little bit more complete way, because what I'm trying to get to is, and I think you already said this too, the question is there one size of federated search that kind of fits everything? Or are there very specific, sub requirements that need like different search functionality and or platform interoperability? Again, speaking about all these different types of data stores, what's the real problem first, like that they're really trying to solve? Is it, because my assumption is that the pure form of federated still has its need out there, right? But in general, when people come and say they need federated, they may need actually something more different, like unified, versus federated, right?
Well, yeah, I think So to kind of answer your first question initially that you kind of asked there, I mean, when it comes to federated search, when it comes to a federation, when it comes to an enterprise, I mean, there really isn't, the sky's the limit almost on what you could potentially need from business requirements. I mean, hey, I need to search a leisure that's in an AS400 site, and at the same time, I need to be able to pull, wiki pages off of Wikipedia. I mean, there could
Right.
be any number of use cases there. The I think the challenge that most of the marketers are really trying to solve is twofold, and I think they're trying to solve it in one action, but they're trying to solve the two problems. And the first one is I want to make content easy to find and accessible for my users.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, that content lives in 13 systems.
Yep.
So it's hard for a marketer to think, how am I going to get all of this content from different systems into a point where a user can easily use their system and find the content they're using for it, they're looking for.
Right.
That's to me, that's the number one challenge I think people are facing when they start thinking about federated search or unified search. And I do think there's a limit to what unified search can do.
Mhm.
And it's largely around the number of systems and just how different your data is.
Right.
If as an example, let's say we have a website that is I'm making something up here, that's a blog post aggregator
Mhm.
for a stock exchange.
Right.
Well, so we're going to go out, we're going to have a whole bunch of crawlers. We can grab the title, we can grab the author, we can grab the content title. And even if those systems represent the data a little bit differently, a blog post is a blog post. We know it's going to have some headers, we know it's going to have a heading, we know it's going to have a byline, we know it's going to have content, might even have a picture. So
Right.
we can craft crawlers that are going to go through and set that up. Oh, and by the way, we also want to return stock quotes. And
Yeah.
It's different data. Google solves this really easily. Google does it, but they scan everything. I mean, Google's the ultimate example of a unified index.
Right. Exactly.
And
Pulling
but
from everywhere.
most most companies, most people, most marketers that are looking for search stuff for their own website, I don't think they're looking to create Google.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now,
Right.
design's a completely different perspective. A lot of people just want the design to mimic the simple ease of use of Google and just give me the search bar and go and give me results. But that's a whole nother
Yeah.
topic.
So what I'm hearing is that there is, like you said, there's a million use cases, but at the core, the problem is really just about heterogeneous data sets, data stores everywhere, and I really want to just simplify that search experience. But then you touched on something that maybe what I'd like to drill into is that there is still a need for federated in some cases, right? I mean, like unified solve, yeah. And so is that like industry specific, or are there specific industries that need federated more than others? And then like what about use cases? Like at the use case level, do we see, like, for example, certain custom apps that might need federated, or maybe like from a compliance standpoint or privacy security standpoint, or is it just more like a fundamental site search requirement?
I think you've kind of asked a couple of interesting questions there, and I do think that I'm actually going to take the last thing you mentioned there, because compliance is a big piece. When we start looking at things like GDPR, where the data resides is actually very important. And if we start unifying information and putting data into some other location, that data is still held to the GDPR standard. And
Right.
and so if we're putting personal information, which honestly I don't think you ever should, but if we're putting personal information into a unified search, structure, we need to understand that data is now under the compliance rules of GDPR, maybe potentially California, Consumer Protection Act, a couple other. There's all kinds of regulations now, and
Yeah,
as time moves on, those regulations are getting even more stringent. So
exactly.
in those cases, the risk that the companies might take on to have that unified index might be greater than the need of or the ease of use for that company to be able to provide the unified index. And in that regard, you would want to have some kind of federation where my query is reaching into this other system that is protected by GDPR in order to return the results, and no, I'm not storing that information anywhere. So I think compliance does play a role there. Industry wise, I mean, maybe some industries need it more than others, but I don't think it's necessarily industry specific. I would say more to the point, I would say it's use case specific. More
Right.
importantly, I would say just what is the data?
Exactly.
What is the content that, where does that content live? What is the content? And that's going to drive a lot of your business decisions around your use cases, depending on what kind of data you're working with.
And is it fair to say then that, generally speaking, internal, like what you mentioned before, like the workplace search type of use case is probably going to need a little bit more around that compliance aspect because you're dealing with customer data, PII potentially, other things like that, versus if you're just like looking at a, kind of corporate website or like a standard informational digital experience that is not, rooted in e-commerce.
Yeah.
General, it's not going to be a big problem, right? I mean, is that fair?
Not just compliance, Jay, governance. I may not want to show everybody the search results. I may have privileged people who can only see certain search results in that workplace environment.
Right.
So, the governance standards also plays a role there, because if we're, now talking about having to gate, search results based on that adds complexity to the use case and complexity to the solution.
Right.
But, largely, especially when we're talking about the clients that, the type of customers that are using our products, and where SearchStax really fits in is, I mean, we're talking about data that's largely already publicly available.
Exactly.
We're just crawling public websites. We're I'm not going to name names. We have a customer currently right now that we just finished some implementation of. They're storing every single one of their contracts into a digital asset management tool, and we're scanning all those contracts and making it available for anybody to search against them.
Right.
So, I mean, again, it's a great use for a unified search because we can distill the different parts of the search query result that we're looking for from, different parts of the contract and still be able to merge that with website content.
Right. So yeah, and what I'm hearing then is that, again, in today's sort of like, especially the markets that we service, right? It's the federated requirement is not really going to be an issue most of the time. Like you said, it's publicly available information.
And honestly, if it is a requirement, maybe our tool's not the best.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. What about, let's switch context for a second here into, skill sets. So let's talk about some of the organizational skill sets that, these teams are going to need in order to satisfy this particular requirement. So, is it going to be different than what people are doing today? Or is it, so for example, with like self-managed solar, which obviously we provide our cloud product, or, DIY site search. So in other words, if you're in that team right now today, and you're looking at this problem, do you need like a new set of skills in order to solve this sort of like unified, search and or federated? Or is it going to be more like kind of what you were mentioning before, as long as you sort of understand the methodology, then you pretty much have what you need, right? And again, I'm asking this question to kind of tease out whether or not this is something that people should view as like, you know, a pretty big barrier challenge, or is it something that's pretty straightforward and like has been solved, you know?
You know,
easy?
I would say that largely. Let me think about that for a second. I would say that largely, um, you know, when it comes down to the search, when it comes down to search results, actually, and I'm speaking more from my own experiences. I mean, I spent 15 years in a consulting world, in the consulting world, where we're having to create solution, like full solutions for potential clients or clients, you know, for their entire website. And so in those cases, the priority of search becomes almost like, and I hate to say it, but almost like the redheaded stepchild.
Mhm.
Because what happens is that the focus is on the homepage, the focus is on the landing pages, the focus is on the article pages. And then
Right.
3 months into design planning, the developer goes, well, what about the search result page? And then a designer quickly stubs out a search result page that looks like Google custom search results. and then because at the end of the day, I think largely it's time, potentially, that people just, you know, they don't think about search results as a first class citizen to their website. They think of it as like a second or third class citizen.
Right.
And so because of that, when it comes down to time and budget, you're suddenly out of both.
Gotcha.
Or when it is thought of, there's not, I would say the other barrier there is really just, you know, strategy around how you do search. And so because a lot of developers look at it and approach the search result problem as I have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, Sitecore did this, right? In fact, I think actually to some extent, I blame Sitecore a little bit, at least in the Sitecore world, for this, because they created a custom search results API that was a wrapper around Solar, basically.
Right.
But they didn't include any starter kits or GUIs or anything like that. It's just a .NET API,
Mhm.
and developers were left to create result pages. And so they were doing this handcrafted, because that's largely what you do with Sitecore. You handcraft your views, you handcraft your UI to use the APIs that Sitecore has provided. So to a Sitecore developer in the Sitecore world, that is the
I see.
standard. Like you don't even bat your eye when somebody says, "Oh, I'm just going to recreate a search UI." You just go off and create a search rule. Well, it must have some results. It's going to be a repeating element. There's probably going to be some kind of filtering on the left side, or maybe on the top, or maybe on the right. I don't know. It depends on what my designer wants to do. But I'm going to go ahead and hand keep. They don't even. It is furthest from their imagination that, oh, there's a tool out there that I can just drop. And
Yeah.
maybe drop is too watered down. Like it requires some implementation, but like we can drop our accelerator to most applications and have a search experience up in short time. And then the developer doesn't have to think about the design. The developer doesn't have to think about reinventing the wheel every time. And then we get rid of the content search API, which frankly, not my favorite.
I see your point though, that in other words, it's like it took you so far, but really the bulk of the really heavy lift was still very much there. And that's really like arcane work. It's not
Oh yeah.
yeah.
And the reason why is it's an education gap. Like we just, you know, developers aren't aware that there's another way to do it. And because we're so trained to just do it ourselves, do it, you know, DIY basically, that, you know, we either borrow from the project we did last time,
Yeah.
or we reinvent it.
Right. Yeah.
And
Like
when you start thinking about like consulting companies, that's the name of the game. Whatever wheel you invented in the last project, reuse that wheel, and
exactly.
they don't never differ from it. So they just keep reusing that wheel, even though there's probably a better wheel out there.
Yep. Yeah, of course. Yeah, repurpose what you have, right?
So educating those people, especially those in the leadership of devs and leadership of the tech side, that say, hey, there is a different wheel. We can show you a better wheel. Um,
yeah, that's key.
education.
That's key. Yeah. What advice would you give to somebody who's, just kind of starting down this path for the first time in terms of having to the problem statement from before? You have lots of different data everywhere. What pitfalls can they avoid when they're just kind of thinking about building, again, either federated or unified, however we want to look at it. But the point is, when they're trying to do that, search capability that solve that particular problem that we mentioned before into their environment, what advice would you give?
I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is don't boil the ocean in the first month. Like, figure out the minimum viable product, do one or two external websites, maybe even start by just getting your content management system, whether you're using Sitecore, Drupal, Adobe, whatever it is. Maybe just start by getting that into a better search capability, and then add in other sites. If you try to do it all encompassing, which I mean you can, proper planning, stuff like that, it's really just going to lengthen your adoption time, which is going to cause complexity to the overall build,
Yeah,
and you might start seeing yourself walk away from the accelerator, which then starts to invite custom development efforts,
right.
which doable, and we have an API system that provides that. And I can tell you one other thing I forgot to mention about the developer because it just popped into my head. In those scenarios where we're either reusing the wheel or reinventing the wheel, especially around like with the custom search API from Sitecore, we might still be building custom UIs with SearchStax Studios. There's not a single application out there that a developer has done against Sitecore that provides like the analytics, the stop words usage, the ability for boosting. In fact, that's a very common ticket for a developer, is to get a marketer to send a ticket to development and say, please boost a field.
Right.
And that's a code effort. You attach it to the backlog, apply it to a sprint, you're out 2 weeks for that development sprint to mature, then you're out for another 2 weeks for the release cycle. And so maybe a month later you get it into working. And that's common practice, and that's accepted common practice.
Right. Like you said earlier, we've been trained to accept these these timelines. So can you give a couple of examples, and maybe I'll even, kind of cover the previous question too, which was about the skill sets again. But what I'm trying to give is people a sense of like a couple of real world examples where you've worked. You mentioned a customer that we're working with more recently, but can you just paint the picture from a real world standpoint where, comment, if you can, as you're doing it, comment on both the kind of the skill sets needed as well as, this advice of like making sure you don't boil the ocean as you're going through it. And maybe without calling out the customer name, if you can just kind of give an example where, that worked well because they took a more kind of stepwise approach to it, and what skills were needed at that point. You just kind of gave like the very conceptual version of that, which was great, and so I'd just love to tie it to some concrete.
Yeah, so I mean, from a concrete perspective, there's two things we're looking at here. We're looking at the developer persona, and we're looking at the marketer persona. And the marketer persona can be technical or non-technical; it doesn't matter.
Right.
So from a marketer's perspective, the skill set that's really needed is they just need to understand their business use cases, and they need to understand why search is important. They need to understand like why relevancy is important, and really have a clear understanding that this is what their users are searching for, and why they're using. That's the responsibility of the marketer. On the developer side, the competency is going to lie in a couple different spots. One, know your CMS. Obviously, you're going to be integrated into a CMS. You're going to have to know your CMS. But more importantly, I mean, API development is becoming more and more of a mainstream thing. We think about headless, and I'm using headless just in a broad sense, right?
Right.
It's all API driven, and our studio product is definitely at the end of the day a API first application. So so being able to like integrate front end technology, whether it's JavaScript or React or Vue or any of these others, is an important concept. um there are, we even provide some help, some like helper modules, like as an example, Sitecore as an example has SXA, which is Sitecore Experience Accelerator. We have a drop-in module for SXA that kind of exposes our accelerator and gets a Sitecore experience going even faster, but the dev is still going to need to know Sitecore. So
Right.
so understand that you need to know your technologies, that while we have an accelerator, you're still going to have to implement it, and there's still going to be an implementation time frame on that. And use cases and customizations are only going to complicate that. And I think that's okay, because if that's what you're signing up for, if that's what, hey, we want the promise of studio because of what the back end part of it provides, which is the relevancy, the boosting, the promotions, all the features of studio that we actually love, because those are the pieces that nobody really does.
Right.
You can be okay with a custom dev effort. You can be okay with some implementation. And so I think that's the expectation that just needs to be set is, no, you're gonna have to have somebody that knows your front ends, knows the, the content management systems, and patience at the end of the day, right? I mean, that's with any development effort. A good example where we had a customer kind of, I would say, not boil the ocean exactly, and I'm gonna use one that we just kind of, and they're not live yet, but we decided we would do a proof of concept with them first to make sure that it was something. This is a good example where take some baby steps, get to know the product first. So we did about a month or two proof of concept with them where they have to, I mean, at the end of the day, they're going to have to, I'm going to use the word federate just because I'm using the common terminology, that they have about 50 websites and they want to be able to show all of the content in a search experience from all of these different bespoke websites into a single search experience. And we kind of looked at it from an aspect of, all right, well, why don't we just take two of those sites? Let's just take two of those sites and see what kind of see how quickly you're able to implement those two and kind of get a search result experience that you desire. And that really helped kind of focus in on the APIs, focus in on how to actually build the results, and kept the noise out from what are these other 49 different websites that we're going to have to integrate with. And that has opened it up, because now that we did two sites, now they're like, oh, now we see how we can do the other 50, and that fear of the size of the Goliath basically is gone, and they now understand that, oh, this is really simple to do. We just kind of have to replicate it, and so now, I think they're on a pathway to big success.
Oh, that's awesome. So again, that it sounds like we provided a lot of sort of initial guidance on the planning itself. In other words, like you said, not boiling the ocean, making sure that there's a kind of a logical progress, in place, how to get to that point. What was some of that specific guidance that you gave, like, and this question is really the last one, but it's more about, like, for people who are looking at SearchStax, is there any guidance that you can give them that helps them determine quickly whether or not we will be a good solution for them to explore when it comes to Federated? And so maybe if you could expound a little bit on what you just mentioned with that current customer, what were some of the discussions that were had early on to determine whether there was a good fit? And then maybe you can just also comment generically about that too for everybody.
Well, I think what was really interesting, especially for this particular customer, is that they they approached us initially with a boil the ocean mentality. They had probably, I'm going to make up a number here, they probably had 35 different requirements, everything from like AI to natural language processing to, 37 different languages to, all kinds of different requirements. And to be quite honest, like some of that stuff, our product's not there yet. We don't, we don't have any natural language processing in our product. We don't have a lot of AI built into our product.
Right.
So in those cases, we ourselves have to be just very transparent and honest and say these are the features of our site. And so for somebody else wanting to kind of say, hey, these are the features that matter to me. What are the features that are really your requirements, and what are your features that are your nice to have?
Right.
Because if your nice to haves is natural language processing, well, we're going to continue to evolve our product. Like I don't see a world where our studio product doesn't come into a natural language processing down the line.
Exactly.
Like so there's going to be product evolution. If that is your core requirement and you must have this on day one, we're not going to be able to help you on that, to be quite honest. But it's really understanding what are your requirements and what really are your day one requirements. And if your day one requirements are, I just need 3 websites, or maybe the number of websites doesn't even count. I just need content from multiple websites show up under 5 different languages.
Yep. Was there anything specific to the federated aspect, the federated / unified, federated versus unified aspect of that conversation that was had as well with the customer in terms of being a good fit? Because you mentioned some of these other features that obviously, as you work through it, identified as more nice to haves, but on the federated side, were there any kind of like distinctions between must have, ways of doing federated versus, the path that we take which is more unified?
No, in fact, I mean, once we just kind of describe that, the commonplace term of federation is really unified indexing, like they were fine. And because at the end of the day, and I think largely this is where this is the important takeaway nugget, right? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's federated or unified. At the end of the day, I'm able to execute a search query and I get results from that are in full, all encompassing of multiple sites. If that happens, what happens under the covers, generally the marketer's not going to care about.
Right. Unless in those very few cases that we mentioned earlier with when the compliance and the governance, those kinds of things. But for the bulk of these, public facing websites, not going to be an issue.
Yep.
That's great. I really appreciate this discussion. I think, like you said, that's a key takeaway. Understand your requirement well. We covered everything else, like skill sets, even, kind of what you need to be focused on and aware of as both a digital marketer and as a developer. And we also talked about, just the whole concept of what federated really means and how people kind of like I like your term, this is like the just kind of regular sort of use of federated, right? And then, we also identified that it's probably going to be more use case specific than, industry. So it sounds like what we're really saying is at the end of the day, take a logical stepwise approach, be realistic about it. We can help you. We have both the product as well as sort of the internal, consultative knowledge to help people kind of get started. So that's it. I mean, this was super useful and helpful, hopefully for a lot of people out there. Any other kind of closing comments?
Don't talk to strangers. No, I'm kidding. No, I mean, this. I think this has been a kind of a good discussion, and it's been great to kind of take a dive into some of these areas. I think, I do think we don't talk enough about the differences between unified and federated, because I do think people largely just understand that they're going to be able to execute a query and get results, but there are particulars under the covers, and I think just making sure that you really understand your use cases and what are your must-have requirements, and then we can work through that, and we can do a proof of concept. We can do a trial. We can show you how Studio really can work with those use cases. And then we'll also be upfront and say, hey, you know what? Studio is not a map.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, agreed. This is a great deep dive into some of these topics. Thanks so much again, Pete. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.